Quickly, let's talk about some criticisms leveled against particularly Christians when we start talking about Islamic Jihad and the spread of Islam around the world at the point of the sword. One of the common criticisms that Muslims always like to bring up is, well, you Christians have no right to talk about the violent spread of Islam. Christianity is filled with its own forms of violence, particularly the Crusades. So you guys have the same problem in your history as we do. How dare you criticize us for Islamic Jihad? Right? Well, that on the face of it, that may seem to be a legitimate criticism. Because there are Christians who have engaged in violent things in the name of Christianity, and the Crusades was one of those. Black marks, black stains on Christian history. That's undeniable. We can't deny that. But let's do an honest comparison between Islamic Jihad and the Crusades and see if they actually are comparable. When you look at the history of Islamic Jihad and you compare it against the Crusades, you find we can make some interesting observations. For example, with the idea of imperialism. Just comparing Islamic Jihad and the Crusaders of the 11th century. Who were the first imperialists? Christians or Muslims? We just saw maps of the spread of Islam just within the first 100 years after Muhammad's death, when Islam spread both east and west and covered a significant portion of the world as they knew it then. The Crusades didn't come along for 400 years later. So who was involved in conquering people first? The Crusaders or the Muslims? Who was first? Second of all, the scope of the Crusades versus the scope of Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad has been going on since the death of Muhammad, and even before. We talked about the Battle of Badr. Even during Muhammad's lifetime, he would send out people to capture people who did not worship Muhammad, who did not embrace Islam, even among the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. In his lifetime, Muhammad himself was responsible for the elimination of every last Jew from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. With his slaughtering of the Banu Qurayza. The Banu Qurayza was the last surviving Jewish tribe there. When he beheaded their 800 men in one night, that was the extinction of Jews on the Arabian Peninsula. Scope of the jihads. Scope of the jihad versus the scope of the Crusades. Jihad has been going on for 1,400 years, ever since the death of Muhammad. The Crusades, however, were limited to a less than 200-year period. So the scopes are entirely different. The Crusades were a very limited scope for a very limited time, and then once they were done, that was the end of it. They have not been an ongoing function of violent Christians, if you want to call them that. Thirdly, the example of Muhammad versus the example of Jesus. When Christians engage in violence in the name of Christianity, are they following the teachings of Christ? Remember what Jesus told Peter when Peter pulled out his sword and cut off the ear of Malchus? What did Jesus tell Peter? Peter, put away your sword, for those who live by the sword die by the sword. Jesus never taught violence. In fact, as far as our persecutors are concerned, he says, pray for those who persecute you. Pray for those who spitefully use you. Love even your enemies. If you only love those who love you, what good is that? What merit is that to you? What credit is that to you? Even sinners and tax collectors do the same thing. So Jesus taught a message of love. Jesus never advocated warfare. Muhammad, on the other hand, not only advocated warfare, he participated in it. So when we look at Jesus and compare him to Muhammad, we see two completely different paradigms. When Christians are engaging in warfare in the name of Christ, they are acting contrary to the teachings of Christ and his example. But when Muslims engage in warfare in the name of Islam, they're not only acting in accord with what their scripture teaches, but they're acting in accord with what their prophet set the example for. Completely different paradigm. So there's no comparison. When Muslims try to compare the Islamic Jihad to Islamic Jihad to Christian Crusades, They're trying to compare apples to grapes. It's an illegitimate comparison.